In the spring of 1873, beneath the crushing weight of a collapsed Montana cabin, a young widow-to-be screamed for a stranger to save her baby first, not knowing that the drifter who tore through the rubble with bleeding hands would become the foundation of everything she'd ever need. This is a story about a man who thought he was just passing through, a woman who refused to be saved, and the love they built from wreckage. Stay with me until the end to see how their story unfolds, and comment below with your city so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The Montana sky stretched endless and indifferent above Jonah Reeves as his horse picked its way through the spring grass, still damp from yesterday's rain. He'd been riding for 3 days straight, moving from one nothing town to the next, the way he'd been moving for the better part of 5 years. No destination, no purpose beyond the next meal, the next campfire, the next sunrise that looked exactly like the last one. He was 28 years old and felt ancient. The war had done that to him, not the Confederate Army itself, though God knew those years had been brutal enough. But what came after? Coming home to Tennessee to find his parents dead of fever, his younger sister married off to a carpetbagger, and the family farm sold for taxes he couldn't pay because he'd been too busy bleeding in Virginia. He'd tried to settle, tried to work other men's land, tried to build something new, but the ghosts followed him, and after a while it seemed easier to just keep moving. So he moved. Montana Territory was as good a place as any to disappear. The mountains didn't care who you'd been. The wind didn't ask questions. A man could ride for days without seeing another soul, and Jonah had learned to prefer it that way. He was thinking about where to make camp, another hour, maybe 2, before the sun started its descent, when he heard it. A scream. Not an animal. Human. Desperate and raw and so full of terror that his horse spooked sideways, ears flattened. Jonah's hand went instinctively to the rifle on his saddle, his body tensing with old soldier reflexes. But this wasn't a battle cry or an ambush yell. This was someone in agony. It came again, weaker this time, from somewhere to the east. He didn't think, didn't weigh options or consider whether this was his problem to solve. He just spurred his horse toward the sound, crashing through scrub brush and around a stand of cottonwoods until he broke into a clearing. What he saw stopped his heart. A homestead cabin, or what was left of one, sagged in on itself like a dying beast. The roof had collapsed completely on one side. The support beams splintered like matchsticks. Raw lumber jutted at ugly angles. A vegetable garden lay trampled under fallen timber. A water barrel had rolled into the dirt, and from somewhere inside that wreckage came another scream, followed by a sound that made Jonah's blood run cold. A baby crying. He was off his horse before he consciously decided to dismount, hitting the ground at a run. "Hello, can you hear me?" "Here!" A woman's voice, hoarse and breaking. "Please, please, my baby!" Jonah reached the edge of the collapsed structure and dropped to his knees, trying to see through the gaps in the broken boards. Dust hung thick in the air, the smell of fresh-cut wood mixed with something else. Blood, maybe, or just fear so sharp it had a scent. "Where are you?" "Corner, northwest corner. Please hurry." He found a gap between 2 fallen beams and peered inside. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. A woman, maybe 23 or 24, pinned from the waist down under a massive roof timber. Her dress was torn, her dark hair wild with dust and debris. Blood streaked her temple. But her arms were wrapped around a tiny bundle, holding it above her chest, keeping it safe from the weight that was crushing her. The bundle was crying, the woman was crying, and the whole damn structure was groaning like it wanted to finish the job. "My baby," the woman gasped. "Please, take my baby." "I'm going to get you both out," Jonah said, surprised at how steady his voice sounded when his hands were shaking. "Just hold on." "No time." She coughed, and blood flecked her lips. "The beam's cracking. I can feel it. Please, just take Lily." Jonah looked at the beam pinning her. She was right. A long split ran down its length, opening wider even as he watched. When it gave way completely, it would crush her and the baby both. "Listen to me," he said, forcing authority into his voice, the same tone he'd used to steady green soldiers under fire. "I need you to stay calm. Can you reach the baby up toward me if I clear a path?" Yes, I think so." "Then that's what we're going to do. But you're not dying today, you hear me? Neither of you." He pulled back and surveyed the wreckage with the cold calculation of a man who'd survived too many impossible situations to believe in impossible anymore. The main collapse had created a rough triangle of space where the woman and baby were trapped. If he could widen the gap at the top, she might be able to push the infant through. Then he'd need to lift that beam somehow. His eyes fell on his horse, still standing where he'd left it, trained well enough not to bolt despite the chaos. Rope. He had rope. Jonah ran to his saddlebags and grabbed the coil of hemp rope he carried for making camp. His hands were already bleeding from clawing at the sharp edges of broken boards, but he didn't feel it. Didn't feel anything except the drumbeat of that baby's cries and the memory of screams he hadn't been able to answer in Tennessee, in Virginia, in all the places he'd failed before. Not this time. He tied one end of the rope around his saddle horn with knots his father had taught him 30 years ago, then scrambled back to the wreckage. "I'm coming in," he called. "Don't move." "Please, hurry. It's shifting." Jonah squeezed through the gap, ignoring the way broken wood tore at his shirt and gouged his shoulders. The space inside was even smaller than it looked, hot and airless and vibrating with tension. He could see the woman's face now, pale as death but fierce with determination. Her eyes were brown, he noticed, the color of good earth, and they were fixed on him with an intensity that made him feel like he was the only thing standing between her and the end of the world. Maybe he was. "What's your name?" he asked, working to clear boards away from above her, creating a channel toward the outside light. "Marion," she whispered. "Marion Hale." "Jonah Reeves. Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Hale, though I wish it were under better circumstances." A sound that might have been a laugh or a sob caught in her throat. "My husband, he went to town. He should have been back." "We'll find him. Right now, let's focus on you and this little one." He'd cleared enough space now, just barely wide enough for an infant to fit through. "All right, Marion, I need you to lift her up as high as you can. I'm going to pull her out, and then I'm going to get you out. That's a promise." Marion's face crumpled for just a moment. "If something happens, if you can't, her name is Lily. She's 4 months old. Her voice broke. "She deserves to know her mother loved her more than anything." "You're going to tell her yourself," Jonah said flatly. "Now lift." Marion gritted her teeth and raised her arms, muscles trembling with effort. The baby, Lily, emerged from the shadows, her face red and screwed up with crying, her tiny fists waving. She was wrapped in a blanket that had once been white, but was now gray with dust. Jonah reached down and took her, his large, scarred hands awkward around something so small and fragile. He'd held rifles, held reins, held dying men. He'd never held a baby. "I've got her," he said. "She's safe." For one moment, Marion's face transformed. Pure relief, pure love, pure gratitude, bright enough to hurt. Then the beam above her gave a splintering crack, and her expression changed to terror. "Go," she screamed. "Get her out! Go!" Jonah didn't argue. He backed out of the wreckage as fast as he could, cradling Lily against his chest, feeling the whole structure shudder around him. He emerged into the sunlight just as another section of roof caved in with a sound like thunder. "No," he said through his teeth. "No, God damn it, no." He ran to his horse and shoved the crying baby into one of his saddlebags. Not gently, but safely, cushioned by his extra shirt. She screamed louder, but she was out. She was safe. Now for her mother. Jonah grabbed the free end of the rope and ran back to the collapsed cabin, circling until he found an angle. The main support beam that had her pinned, if he could loop the rope around it, used the horse as a pulley. The structure groaned. Dust poured from new cracks. "Marion, can you hear me?" "Yes." Her voice was so faint now. "Is Lily—" "She's fine. She's crying her lungs out, which means she's perfect. Now I need you to stay with me because I'm about to do something either very clever or very stupid." He squeezed back into the wreckage from a different angle, rope in hand. The space had gotten smaller. The beam had settled another 6 inches. Marion's breathing was rapid and shallow. Can't breathe." "Yes, you can. You're talking, which means you're breathing. Keep talking to me, Marion. Tell me about Lily. Tell me something good." She smiled yesterday," Marion gasped. For the first time, real smile, not just gas. That's good. That's real good. What else? Jonah worked the rope around the beam, his fingers clumsy with blood and urgency. She has my eyes. My mother's eyes. Brown, I noticed, pretty eyes. The rope was through. He started backing out. What else? She grabs my finger when I feed her, holds on so tight, like she knows that you love her. She knows. Jonah was outside again, running for his horse. Keep talking. Jonah, her voice cracked. If you can't, tell her yourself. He reached his horse, grabbed the reins. I'm going to ask him to pull, and when that beam lifts, you drag yourself out. Don't think. Don't hesitate. Just move. You understand? Yes. Jonah looked at the angle of the rope, the distance to the beam, the way the horse was positioned. It might work. It might not. The beam might lift, or the whole structure might come down. They might have 30 seconds or 3. He'd survived on worse odds. All right, Dante, he said to his horse, using the calm voice that had gotten them through storms and river crossings and one memorable cougar encounter. Easy now, just a few steps back. He clicked his tongue and applied gentle pressure to the reins. The horse stepped back. The rope went taut. The beam shifted. And from inside the wreckage, Marion screamed. Keep going, Jonah yelled. Don't stop. Marion, start moving. Another step. Another. The beam was lifting inch by terrible inch. Through gaps in the boards, Jonah could see movement. Marion dragging herself forward on her elbows, her legs bloody and useless behind her. That's it! Keep coming! The beam lifted another foot, and suddenly Marion was in the channel he'd cleared earlier, pulling herself toward the light with hands torn and desperate. Jonah dropped the reins and lunged for her, grabbing her wrists and hauling her the last few feet just as the entire northwest corner of the cabin collapsed in on itself with a roar that shook the ground. They tumbled together into the dirt, Jonah shielding Marion's body with his own as debris rained down around them. Wood splinters, dust clouds, the sound of destruction. And then, silence. Jonah raised his head, coughing, checking Marion's face. She was unconscious, her head lolling against his shoulder, but she was breathing. Her legs were a mess, bruised, bleeding, maybe broken, but she was out. She was alive. From the saddlebag, Lily's cries cut through the settling dust. Jonah started laughing. He couldn't help it. The sound came out half-mad, shaky with relief and residual terror. We did it, he said to no one, to the sky, to whatever force had put him in this particular place at this particular moment. We actually did it. He stood carefully, Marion limp in his arms, and carried her away from the destroyed cabin to a patch of grass near his horse. Lily was still screaming, red-faced and furious at the indignity of being stuffed in a saddlebag. Jonah pulled her out and laid her on Marion's chest, and even unconscious, Marion's arms came up automatically to hold her baby. The sight hit Jonah somewhere in the center of his chest, a feeling he'd thought the war had burned out of him years ago. Hope. He built a fire as the afternoon sun crawled toward evening, set water to boil, cleaned Marion's wounds as best he could with torn strips from his spare shirt. She woke once, gasping in pain, and he talked to her in the same steady voice he'd used in the wreckage, promising her she was safe, that Lily was safe, that he wasn't going anywhere until he was sure they'd be all right. Why? Marion whispered at one point, her eyes glassy with pain and shock. Why did you stop? Jonah paused in wrapping her leg. Heard you scream. But you don't know us. You don't owe us anything. He met her eyes then, those brown eyes that had looked at him with such faith when he was all that stood between her and death. Maybe not, he said quietly, but I heard you, and I couldn't just ride past. Marion's hand found his, gripped it with surprising strength. Thank you, she said. Thank you for my baby. Thank you for... Her voice broke. For both of us. Rest now, Jonah said, uncomfortable with her gratitude. We'll move you to town come morning. My husband, Thomas. He went to Iron Creek 3 days ago. He should have been back. Something cold settled in Jonah's gut. A man who left his wife and infant alone in a homestead cabin for 3 days. A man who wasn't there when the roof came down. We'll find him, Jonah promised, though he had a bad feeling about what they'd find. Night fell. Jonah kept the fire going, and Lily quiet with sugar water on his finger, a trick his mother had used with his sister 20 years ago. Marian drifted in and out of consciousness, fever making her restless. Jonah bathed her forehead with cool water and told her stories about nothing, about his horse, about the weather, about the elk he'd seen yesterday, just keeping his voice steady and present so she wouldn't feel alone. At some point deep in the night, Marian woke fully. The fire had burned low. Lily was asleep in a nest of blankets. And Jonah was keeping watch, his rifle across his knees, his eyes scanning the darkness for threats that probably weren't coming. "You're still here," Marian said. "Told you I would be." Most men wouldn't have stopped at all, much less stayed. Jonah fed another stick to the fire. "I'm not most men." "No," Marian said softly. "I don't suppose you are." In the firelight, with her face bruised and her hair tangled and her dress torn and bloodied, Marian Hale should have looked broken. But there was something in her eyes, something steady and determined and utterly undefeated, that told Jonah this woman might bend under weight, but she wouldn't break. "Tell me what happened," he said. "To the cabin." Marian was quiet for a long moment. "The support beam on the northwest corner, Thomas said it was fine, that I worried too much, but I could see the crack spreading. I told him we needed to fix it before—" She stopped, swallowed. "Yesterday morning, I was inside with Lily. I heard this sound like something groaning, and then everything just came down." "How long were you trapped?" "Hours. I don't know how many. I screamed until my voice was gone, and then I heard your horse." Jonah nodded slowly. "Your husband. How long ago did you say he left?" 3 days. He went to Iron Creek to sell some furs, buy supplies. He said he'd be back by nightfall." Marian's voice went flat. "That was 3 nights ago." The cold feeling in Jonah's gut got colder. Does he do that often? Stay gone longer than planned?" Marian looked away. "Sometimes. There's a saloon in Iron Creek. Thomas likes cards." "And whiskey?" "That too." Jonah bit back the things he wanted to say about a man who'd leave his wife and baby alone in a failing cabin to drink and gamble. "Well," he said instead, "come morning, we'll head to town. Get you to a doctor. Find your husband. And then? Then we'll figure out what comes next." Marian studied him across the fire, her intelligent eyes reading things about him he hadn't meant to show. "You're not from Montana." "Tennessee." "You were in the war." It wasn't a question. Jonah nodded once. "And after?" "After I rode west, didn't much care where I ended up." "Do you have family?" "Had. Sister, but we lost touch." Jonah stood, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "You should sleep. Long ride tomorrow." "Jonah." He paused, looked back at her. "You saved our lives today. I won't forget that. Ever." Jonah nodded once, not trusting himself to speak, and moved to check on the horses. But he could feel Marian's eyes on him, and when he finally let himself look back, she'd fallen asleep with one hand on Lily's chest, feeling her daughter breathe. In that moment, Jonah Reeves, drifter, veteran, man without purpose, felt something shift inside him. Not dramatically, not with thunder or revelation. Just a quiet certainty that this moment, this choice to stop when he heard a scream, had changed the direction of his life in ways he couldn't yet name. He sat down with his back against a tree, rifle across his lap, and kept watch over 2 strangers who already felt like more. Dawn came gray and cold. Marian woke with a cry of pain when she tried to move her legs. Jonah had to lift her onto his horse. She weighed next to nothing, all bones and determination, and rig a sling to keep Lily secure against her chest. The ride to Iron Creek took 4 hours, Marian biting back whimpers with every step the horse took. "Talk to me," Jonah said when her breathing got too shallow. "Tell me about teaching. You said you were a school teacher." "Was. Before—" Marian stopped, started again. "Before Thomas and I married. I taught in a school back in Ohio. Loved it. The children, the books." Her voice softened. "I always thought I'd teach again someday. Maybe when Lily's older." "You'd be good at it. How would you know?" "The way you talked to her yesterday, when you were trapped. Calm, steady. That takes patience. Marion was quiet for a moment. I wasn't calm. I was terrified. Being terrified and staying calm aren't opposite things. Sometimes they're the same thing. Iron Creek appeared on the horizon around noon, a collection of rough buildings clustered around a main street, the kind of town that existed because the mountains were full of silver and men were full of dreams. Jonah aimed for the biggest building, a two-story structure with boarding house painted across the front. A woman came out onto the porch, saw Marion, and immediately began shouting orders. "Henry, get Dr. Walsh! Someone help this lady down!" Between one moment and the next, Marion and Lily were swept away in a flurry of capable female hands, leaving Jonah standing alone in the street with his horse and a feeling like he'd lost something important. "You did good, bringing her in." The boarding house keeper, a sturdy woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair, looked at him with approval. "That's Marion Hale, isn't it? Tom Hale's wife?" "Yes, ma'am." "Lord have mercy. Where's Tom?" "That's what I aim to find out. Where's the saloon?" Her expression went carefully neutral. "End of the street, the Silver Spur. But? Nothing. Just be prepared for what you might hear." Jonah tipped his hat and headed down the street, that cold feeling back in his gut. The Silver Spur smelled like every saloon Jonah had ever walked into: stale whiskey, old tobacco smoke, and the particular sourness of men drinking away their failures. It was mid-afternoon, too early for the serious gambling crowd, but half a dozen patrons hunched over tables or leaned against the bar, nursing drinks with the dedication of the professionally idle. The bartender looked up when Jonah entered, his eyes narrowing at the blood still dried on Jonah's hands and shirt. "Help you?" "Looking for information about Tom Hale." The room went quiet. Not dramatically, just that subtle shift when men suddenly find their drinks very interesting and stop making eye contact. The bartender set down the glass he'd been wiping. "You family?" "Friend of his wife's." "Ah." The bartender glanced at the other patrons, seemed to make a decision. "Then I'm sorry to tell you Tom Hale's dead. Been 3 days now." Jonah had expected it, but the confirmation still hit him like a fist. "How?" "Gunfight. Over cards." The bartender's voice was carefully neutral. "Tom got drunk. Accused another player of cheating. Problem was, Tom was the one cheating. Bad at it, too. Other fellow called him out. Tom went for his gun." He shrugged. "Wasn't even close. Dead before he hit the floor." Behind Jonah, one of the patrons muttered, "Damn fool. Left his wife and baby alone on that homestead to drink and gamble. Got what was coming." Jonah turned slowly. The speaker was an older man, grizzled and weathered. "You know Marion?" "Know of her. School teacher from back east. Sweet girl. Too good for Tom Hale, that's for damn sure. He won her with pretty words and promises, brought her out here, and spent more time in this saloon than he did on his own land." The man spat into a spittoon. "Some men don't deserve what they got." "Where's Tom buried?" Jonah asked. "Boot Hill, north end of town. Unmarked. Town didn't figure he'd earned a marker." Jonah nodded once and turned to leave. "Hey," the bartender called. "Marion, she all right? Heard you brought her in looking pretty bad." "Her cabin collapsed. She was trapped under it for hours with her baby." The silence this time was complete and horrified. "Jesus," someone whispered. "While Tom was here losing at cards," the grizzled man said, his voice thick with disgust. "That poor woman." Jonah pushed back out into the sunlight, his jaw tight. He should feel something about Tom Hale's death, pity, maybe, or an anger on Marion's behalf. But all he felt was a cold contempt for a man who'd left his family vulnerable while he drank and gambled and cheated at cards. He made his way back to the boarding house where the keeper, Mrs. Cooper, she'd introduced herself as, met him on the porch. "Doctor's with her now," she said. "Both legs badly bruised and cut, but not broken, thank the Lord. She's tough, that one. Hasn't cried once, even when he was cleaning the wounds." "And the baby?" "Perfect, not a scratch on her." Mrs. Cooper's eyes were shrewd. "You're the one who pulled them out?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then you have my gratitude and the gratitude of every woman in this town. Marion Hale's one of the good ones." She paused. "You find Tom?" "He's dead. Saloon gunfight 3 nights ago." Mrs. Cooper closed her eyes briefly. "That poor girl. First she loses her home, now she's a widow with a baby and no prospects. She straightened. Well, we'll help her. The women in this town take care of our own. I need to tell her. Doctor's almost done. You can go up in a few minutes. Jonah waited on the porch, watching Iron Creek go about its afternoon business. The town was bigger than he'd expected. A general store, a church, what looked like a land office, even a small schoolhouse. The kind of place that might last, if the silver held out and the people were determined enough. The kind of place a man could put down roots, if he were the root-putting kind. The doctor emerged, a thin man with spectacles and tired eyes. You Reeves? Yes, sir. She wants to see you, but keep it brief. She needs rest. He paused. You did good work today. Most men would have ridden past, or worse, tried something heroic and gotten all three of you killed. You kept your head. Old habit. Well, it's a good one. She'll recover fully, by the way. A few weeks off those legs and she'll be walking again. Lucky woman. Jonah thought about Marion trapped under a beam, screaming for hours, holding her baby above the rubble. Yeah, he said. Real lucky. He climbed the stairs to the second floor. Mrs. Cooper directed him to the end room. He knocked softly. Come in. Marion was propped up in a clean bed, her legs bandaged and elevated on pillows. Her hair had been washed and braided. Someone had given her a clean nightgown. Lily slept in a basket beside the bed. In the late afternoon light, Marion looked young and frightened and trying very hard to look neither. Jonah. Her voice was steady. Mrs. Cooper said you went looking for Thomas. He pulled a chair close to the bed and sat. There was no good way to say this, so he said it plain. Tom's dead, Marion. I'm sorry. She didn't gasp or cry out, just went very still, her hands folding together on top of the quilt. How? Gunfight at the saloon, 3 nights ago. Over cards? Yes. Marion nodded slowly, like this confirmed something she'd already suspected. Was he cheating? Jonah hesitated, then decided she deserved the truth. Yes. And drunk? Yes. She looked out the window, her jaw tight. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, he promised me it would be different out here. New start, new life. He said he'd left all that behind, the drinking, the gambling. He said, her voice cracked and she stopped, fought for control. He said he wanted to build something real. For us. For Lily. Marion, no. She held up a hand. I need to say this. I need to. She took a shaky breath. I married him knowing what he was. Not the full extent, maybe, but enough. My parents warned me. My friends warned me. But he was handsome and charming, and I was 20 years old and tired of being a schoolteacher in a small Ohio town where everyone knew my business. So I married him and came west and told myself love could change a man. Sometimes it can, Jonah said quietly. But not this time. Marion's voice was flat now, drained of emotion. He left us 3 days ago to sell furs and buy supplies. Came here instead, drank and gambled while Lily and I sat in a failing cabin, and then he got himself killed over cards while I was trapped under a roof beam screaming for help that wasn't coming. She finally looked at Jonah. Do you know what I felt when you told me he was dead? Jonah shook his head. Relief. The word came out sharp and bitter. My husband is dead, and my first thought was relief that I wouldn't have to lie awake anymore wondering when he'd come home drunk, or if he'd come home at all, or if he'd gamble away the money we needed for winter supplies. Her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. What kind of woman does that make me? Human, Jonah said. It makes you human. I have a 4-month-old baby, and no home, and no husband, and no money. I should be devastated. I should be terrified. Aren't you? Marion smiled then, but it wasn't a happy expression. Terrified, yes. Devastated? She looked at Lily sleeping peacefully in her basket. I have her. Everything else I'll figure out. The strength in her voice, quiet but absolute, reminded Jonah of good steel, the kind that bent under pressure but snapped back true. The town women will help, he said. Mrs. Cooper's already organizing. I'm sure they will, and I'm grateful, but I won't be the poor widow they take pity on forever. Marion's voice hardened with determination. I was a teacher, a good one. This town has a schoolhouse. If they need a teacher, I can do that work. I can support myself and Lily. Your legs will heal. Dr. Walsh said 3 weeks, maybe 4. I can wait that long. She met his eyes. I won't be helpless, Jonah. I can't be. Do you understand? He understood more than she knew. The need to stand on your own feet, even when the ground was shaking. The fear of being dependent, of being weak, of giving anyone else power over your survival. Yes, he said. I understand. Marion relaxed slightly, like she'd been braced for an argument. Thank you for everything. For stopping when you heard me, for saving Lily, for telling me the truth about Thomas instead of pretty lies. What will you do with... He gestured vaguely, meaning the body, the burial, all the grim practicalities of death. Mrs. Cooper says he's already buried. Boot Hill. She swallowed hard. I should visit the grave, I suppose. Say something. But I don't know what. You don't owe him anything. He was my husband, father of my child. He was a drunk and a cheat who left you alone in a death trap. The words came out harsher than Jonah intended, and he checked himself. I'm sorry, that's not... No, Marion said. Don't apologize for speaking truth. I spent 2 years making excuses for him. I'm done with that. She reached out suddenly and took Jonah's hand. Her fingers were cool and surprisingly strong. You didn't have to stop yesterday. You didn't have to help. You could have taken Lily and left me there and told yourself you'd done enough. But you didn't. You risked your life to save a stranger. Why? Jonah looked at their joined hands, at this woman who'd been through hell in the last 2 days and was still worrying about everyone else. I don't know, he said honestly. Maybe because I spent 5 years watching people die and not being able to stop it. Maybe because I was tired of riding past and not mattering. Or maybe... He met her eyes. Maybe I just heard you scream and couldn't live with myself if I didn't try. Marion's grip tightened. Well, I'm glad you tried. Lily's glad you tried. She tell you that? A real smile touched Marion's lips, the first he'd seen. She said, wah, very emphatically. I'm interpreting. Jonah found himself smiling back. Fair translation. Lily chose that moment to wake up, making small, snuffling noises that escalated rapidly toward a cry. Marion tried to reach for her and winced when her bruised ribs protested. Let me, Jonah said, surprising himself. He lifted the baby from her basket with the same careful awkwardness he'd shown the day before. Lily's face was red and screwed up with indignation, her tiny fists waving. Hey there, little one, you're all right. She's hungry, Marion said. If you could just... Jonah handed Lily over, then politely turned his back while Marion settled the baby to nurse. He stood at the window, looking out at Iron Creek's main street, and tried to figure out what he was doing here. He delivered Marion and Lily safely to town. They were in good hands. His duty was done. He should resupply, rest his horse for a day, then move on. There were other territories to drift through, other sunrises to chase. But the thought of leaving made his chest tight in a way he didn't want to examine. Jonah? Marion's voice was soft. You can turn around now. He did. Lily was nursing contentedly, her tiny hand splayed against Marion's chest. Marion was watching him with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to see right through all his careful defenses. What will you do? She asked. Keep drifting? Don't have much else to do. You could stay. Iron Creek's always looking for able men. Ranch work, timber cutting, mining. Probably better than sleeping under stars and eating hardtack. Probably, Jonah agreed, but I'm not much for staying in one place. Why not? Because staying means caring, and caring means losing, and he'd lost enough for one lifetime. But he couldn't say that to this woman who'd just lost everything and was still planning her next move. Just never took to it, he said instead. Marion was quiet for a moment, her hand gentle on Lily's back. Will you stay until I'm walking again? Just a few weeks. I'd feel better knowing you were nearby. It was the I'd feel better that got him. Not a demand or even really a request. Just an admission of need from a woman who hated needing anything. I'll stay, Jonah heard himself say. Few weeks. Make sure you're settled. The relief in Marion's face made something in his chest ache. Over the following days, Jonah fell into a routine he hadn't planned and couldn't quite justify. He took a room at the boarding house, cheapest one available, barely big enough to turn around in, but it had a bed and 4 walls, and that was luxury after 5 years of sleeping rough. He checked on Marion twice daily, morning and evening, bringing her newspapers from the general store and listening to her read aloud while Lily slept. The town women descended like a flock of determined hens. They brought food, clothes, blankets, offers of help. They clucked over Lily and praised Marion's strength and spoke in hushed tones about poor Tom, while their eyes said they weren't surprised at all by how he'd ended. Mrs. Cooper turned out to be the ringleader. "We've decided," she announced on the 3rd day, standing in Marion's doorway with 3 other women flanking her like generals planning a campaign. "When you're healed, you'll teach school. Miss Patterson's been doing it, but she's getting married next month and moving to her husband's ranch. The position's yours if you want it." Marion's face transformed. Yes, I want it, but nothing. You're qualified. You need work. We need a teacher. Simple as that." Mrs. Cooper's expression softened. "The schoolhouse has a small room behind it. Just one room, but there's a stove and a window and it's dry. You and Lily can live there. Won't be fancy, but it'll be yours." Marion's eyes filled with tears she'd been too strong to shed over her husband's death. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know how to—" "You don't need to thank us, honey. Women help women. That's how we survive out here." Mrs. Cooper looked at Jonah, standing awkwardly in the corner. "Though I'll say Mr. Reeves has been a godsend. Never seen a man so dedicated to checking on someone he barely knows." The other women murmured agreement, their eyes speculative in a way that made Jonah deeply uncomfortable. "Just making sure they're all right," he muttered. Mrs. Cooper said, in a tone that suggested she didn't believe that for a second. "Well, we'll leave you to your checking. Come along, ladies." When they'd gone, Marion laughed, actually laughed, and the sound was bright enough to chase shadows from the corners of the room. "You're making them gossip, you know." "Making who gossip?" "The town women. A handsome stranger riding in to save the widow and her baby, then staying around to help? They're already writing the romance in their heads." Jonah felt heat creep up his neck. We're not. I know." Marion's amusement faded into something gentler. "I know what this is, Jonah. You're a good man with a conscience, making sure we're settled before you move on. I'm not reading anything into it." He should have felt relieved. Instead, he felt oddly disappointed. By the end of the 1st week, Marion was sitting up without wincing. By the end of the 2nd, she was standing for short periods, testing her weight on legs that were still purple with bruising, but healing clean. Dr. Walsh pronounced her recovery remarkable and attributed it to her youth and stubbornness in equal measure. Jonah spent his days doing odd jobs around town, fixing Mrs. Cooper's front steps, helping the blacksmith repair a wagon, clearing fallen timber from the road to the silver mine. He didn't need the money particularly, but he needed something to do with his hands, some reason to be in Iron Creek that wasn't watching over a woman who doesn't need watching. But every evening, he found his way back to Marion's room. They'd fallen into an easy pattern. He'd bring something from town, some small thing he'd thought she might need or want, and she'd update him on Lily's developments, or read aloud from whatever book someone had lent her. They talked about inconsequential things mostly. The weather, town gossip, whether the mine would hold out another season. They didn't talk about him leaving, though it hung in the air between them like smoke. On a warm evening 2 weeks after the rescue, Jonah brought wildflowers he'd found growing near the creek. He felt foolish carrying them through town. Sure, everyone was watching, but Marion's face when he handed them over made the embarrassment worth it. "They're beautiful," she said, burying her nose in the blooms. "I haven't had flowers since—" She stopped herself. "Since your wedding," Jonah guessed. Since before that, actually, Thomas wasn't much for romantic gestures. She arranged them in a water glass on the windowsill. "These are better anyway. Honest flowers, given for no reason except kindness." Lily was awake and alert in her basket, making the cooing sounds that Marion swore were almost words. Jonah found himself kneeling beside the basket, letting the baby grab his finger with her surprisingly strong grip. "She likes you," Marion observed. "She doesn't grab just anyone's finger like that." "Smart baby, holding on to what's solid." "Is that what you are? Solid?" Jonah looked up at her, at this woman who'd survived a collapsing cabin and a dead husband, and was planning her future with the same determination she'd used to hold her baby above the rubble. Trying to be. Marion came to sit beside him, still moving carefully but getting stronger every day. Jonah, can I ask you something? Go ahead. Why did you really come west after the war? He should have deflected, changed the subject. But something about the quiet evening and Marion's patient attention made him tell the truth. Lost everything in Tennessee, family farm, parents, sense of who I was. Tried to rebuild, but the ghosts wouldn't leave me alone, so I left instead. Figured maybe out here, where nobody knew me, I could be someone different. Did it work? Don't know yet. Still figuring out who that someone is. Marion's hand covered his where it rested on the edge of Lily's basket. Maybe you're someone who stops when he hears screaming. Maybe you're someone who tears through rubble to save strangers. Maybe, her voice softened. Maybe you're someone who brings wildflowers for no reason except they reminded you of someone. Jonah's throat was tight. Marion, I'm not asking for anything, she said quickly. I know you're leaving. I know this isn't permanent. But I want you to know that you matter. That what you did mattered, that... She squeezed his hand. That whoever you become out here or wherever you end up, you're already someone worth knowing. Before Jonah could find words to answer, the door burst open and Mrs. Cooper rushed in, her face flushed. Marion, Jonah, I hate to interrupt, but there's trouble. Sam Morrison from the land office just came by, says there's a problem with Marion's homestead claim. Marion went pale. What kind of problem? Says it was filed in Thomas's name only, and with him dead and no will. Mrs. Cooper's expression was grim. Says the land reverts to the territory. Someone's already filed a claim on it. Jonah stood slowly. Who? Carter Bellamy. Owns the big ranch south of here. Mrs. Cooper spat the name like poison. Vulture's been trying to get that land for years. Water rights, see? Marion's Creek feeds into the valley. Marion's hands were shaking. But Thomas and I, we built that cabin together. Cleared that land. That's our home. Was your home, Mrs. Cooper corrected gently. But legally, honey, you might not have a claim. Jonah felt cold fury building in his chest. A woman loses her husband, nearly loses her life and her child, and now some land-grabbing bastard wants to take what little she has left. No, he said flatly. That's not happening. Jonah? Marion started. That's not happening, he repeated, meeting her eyes. Tomorrow morning, we go see Morrison. Get the details. Figure out what legal ground you're standing on. And if Bellamy wants a fight... He smiled, and it wasn't a nice expression. Well, I've survived worse fights than land disputes. Marion stared at him, something complicated and unreadable in her eyes. You don't have to do this. It's not your problem. Maybe not, but I'm making it my problem anyway. Mrs. Cooper looked between them, a small smile playing at her lips. Well then, tomorrow morning it is. I'll come with you. Morrison's more likely to be honest with witnesses present. She headed for the door, then paused. You know, Marion, for a woman who's not reading anything into this situation, you're looking at Mr. Reeves like he just promised you the moon. After she left, silence filled the room. Lily gurgled happily, oblivious to the tension. Why? Marion finally asked. Why would you fight my battles when you're planning to leave anyway? Jonah looked at her. Really looked at her. This woman who'd offered him kindness when she had every reason to be selfish with it, who'd thanked him for truth when lies would have been easier, who was building a future from wreckage with nothing but will and determination. Maybe I'm tired of leaving, he said quietly, or maybe... He stopped, not ready to finish that thought, but Marion heard it anyway. He could see it in the way her eyes softened, in the way her breath caught. Stay, she said, not a question this time. A request, an invitation. For the land dispute, Jonah clarified. For the land dispute, Marion agreed. They both knew that wasn't what either of them meant. Sam Morrison's land office occupied a narrow building wedged between the general store and the assayer's office, its windows thick with dust and its interior cluttered with maps, deeds, and the accumulated paperwork of men trying to stake their claims in an unforgiving territory. Morrison himself was a thin man in his 50s with ink-stained fingers and the permanently harried expression of someone who spent his days arbitrating other people's disputes. He looked up when Jonah pushed open the door, Marion leaning on his arm and Mrs. Cooper following like a battle-ready general. His expression turned wary. "Mrs. Hale," he said, standing quickly, "I heard about— I'm very sorry for your loss." "Thank you, Mr. Morrison." Marion's voice was steady, though Jonah could feel the tension in her grip on his arm. "I understand there's a problem with my homestead claim." Morrison's discomfort was palpable. He shuffled papers on his desk, not meeting her eyes. "I'm afraid so. Your late husband filed the claim in his name only. Standard practice at the time, but it means legally she has no claim," Jonah finished, "even though she worked that land alongside him." "I'm afraid that's correct. And with Mr. Hale deceased and no will filed, the land reverts to the territory," Mrs. Cooper said. "We understand the law, Sam. What we want to know is what happens now." Morrison sighed and pulled out a file. "Mr. Carter Bellamy filed a claim on the property 2 days ago. He's offering fair market value for any improvements, the cleared land, the foundation, the well." "The cabin's destroyed," Jonah said flatly. "What's he really after?" "Water rights," Morrison admitted. "That creek runs year-round, feeds into the valley where Bellamy's cattle graze. He's been trying to buy that land for 3 years, but Tom Hale wouldn't sell." "Because it was our home," Marion said, her voice tight. "Because we were building something there." Morrison finally met her eyes, and there was genuine sympathy in his expression. "Mrs. Hale, I know this isn't fair. I know you've been through hell. But the law is the law. Your husband should have filed a joint claim, or better yet, written a will. But he didn't. And now—" He spread his hands helplessly. "Now Bellamy has first rights as a new claimant." "Unless someone contests the claim," Jonah said. "Unless someone contests it, yes. But that requires— "A competing claim filed within 30 days of the previous claim lapsing," Mrs. Cooper interrupted, "and proof of improvements to the land, which Marion has. She and Thomas cleared 6 acres, dug a well, built a cabin." "The cabin's gone," Morrison pointed out. "And proving Mrs. Hale's contribution to those improvements without her name on the original claim," he shook his head. "It would be difficult." "But not impossible," Jonah said. Morrison looked at him properly for the first time. "You are?" "Jonah Reeves, the one who pulled Mrs. Hale and her baby from the collapsed cabin. It wasn't a question. In a town this small, everyone knew everyone's business. That was good work. But this is a legal matter, Mr. Reeves. Good intentions won't— I'm not talking about good intentions. I'm talking about facts. Marion worked that land, planted that garden, hauled water from that creek. Half those improvements are hers by right of labor, even if the law doesn't recognize it." "The law is what matters in land disputes," Morrison said, but there was less certainty in his voice now. Mrs. Cooper leaned forward, her expression sharp. "Sam Morrison, you've known me 20 years. Have I ever lied to you?" "No, ma'am." "Then believe me when I say Marion Hale earned that land 10 times over, and if the law says otherwise, then the law is wrong." She straightened. "Now, what would it take to contest Bellamy's claim?" Morrison looked at the 3 of them, Marion pale but determined, Mrs. Cooper fierce as a mama bear, and Jonah radiating the kind of quiet intensity that suggested he'd fought worse battles than this and won. He sighed. "A competing claim filed before the 30-day window closes. That's in 3 weeks. Proof of prior improvements. Witnesses who can testify to Mrs. Hale's work on the land. And—" he hesitated. "And probably a lawyer, because Bellamy will fight this. He's got money and connections, and he doesn't like losing." "How much does a lawyer cost?" Marion asked quietly. "More than you have," Morrison said, not unkindly. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hale. I truly am. But unless you can come up with funds for legal representation and somehow prove your claim is stronger than Bellamy's—" "I have money," Jonah heard himself say. 3 pairs of eyes turned to him. "I have savings. From the war, from work since then. Enough for a lawyer, if that's what it takes." "Jonah, no. Marion's voice was fierce. I can't let you. You're not letting me anything. I'm offering. He looked at Morrison. If Marion files a competing claim and I back it financially, does she have a chance? Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying Jonah with the assessing gaze of a man who'd seen every kind of land scheme and settler desperation the territory had to offer. Maybe, he finally said. If the lawyer's good, if we can get enough witnesses, if Bellamy doesn't pull strings with the territorial governor, which he's been known to do. He paused. Why would you do this, Mr. Reeves? You're not married to Mrs. Hale, not family. Why spend your money on a legal fight that might not even succeed? Jonah thought about Marion trapped under a beam, begging him to save her baby first. Thought about her refusing to be the town's charity case, determined to stand on her own. Thought about the way she read to Lily in the evenings, and the way she'd looked at him when he brought wildflowers, and the way his chest felt tight every time he thought about riding away from Iron Creek. Because it's the right thing to do, he said simply. Morrison's expression softened. Well then, let's see what we can do. Mrs. Hale, I'll need you to document every improvement you and your husband made to that land. Dates, if you remember them. Details about the work involved. Can you do that? Yes, Marion said, and I'll need witnesses. People who saw you working that homestead. The Johnsons, Marion said immediately. Their ranch is 2 miles east. Sarah Johnson visited monthly. She helped me plant the garden last spring. And Pastor Williams came out twice to, her voice caught, to talk to Thomas about his drinking. He saw the well we dug, the fence line we were building. Good, that's good. Morrison made notes. I'll draw up the competing claim paperwork. You'll need to sign it, Mrs. Hale. And Mr. Reeves, if you're serious about funding legal representation. I am. Then I'd suggest talking to Daniel Frost. He's practicing law in Helena, but he takes cases in Iron Creek sometimes. He's expensive, but he's good. Beats Bellamy in court once before over a mining claim. I'll write to him today, Mrs. Cooper said. We'll need him here within 2 weeks if we're going to prepare properly. Morrison nodded. This won't be easy. Bellamy's going to be furious when he finds out you're contesting. He's used to getting what he wants. Then it's past time he learned different, Jonah said. They left the land office with Marion leaning more heavily on Jonah's arm than when they'd entered. Outside, she stopped and turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Why did you do that? Offer your money? Same reason I stopped when I heard you scream. Couldn't ride past. This is different. This is your savings, Jonah, your future. Money I don't have a use for anyway, and if I did have a use for it, he met her gaze steadily. Can't think of a better one than this. Marion opened her mouth, closed it, then surprised him by rising on her toes and kissing his cheek. Thank you, she whispered against his skin. For everything. For being more than I knew I needed. She pulled back quickly, color rising in her cheeks, and Mrs. Cooper cleared her throat with poorly concealed amusement. Well, the older woman said, I'd say that's enough excitement for one morning. Marion, you need to rest those legs. Jonah, you should probably go find work to replace all that money you just promised to spend. Her eyes twinkled. Though something tells me you're not worried about that. Over the following days, Jonah discovered that preparing for a legal battle involved significantly more paperwork and significantly less actual fighting than the military kind. Marion sat at the small desk in her room, filling page after page with meticulous documentation of every fence post they'd set, every acre they'd cleared, every bucket of water she'd hauled from the creek. Her hand cramped and her head ached, but she didn't stop, driven by the same fierce determination that had kept her alive under the rubble. Jonah spent his time tracking down witnesses. The Johnsons turned out to be a weathered ranch couple in their 40s who remembered Marion well and were more than happy to testify about her work on the homestead. That girl labored like a field hand, Sarah Johnson said, her face creased with sympathy. Saw her hauling rocks to build a root cellar when she was 6 months pregnant. Tom would be in town gambling while Marion did the work of 2 people. She shook her head. If there's justice in this world, she'll keep that land. Pastor Williams was equally supportive, though his testimony carried a darker edge. I counseled Thomas Hale 3 times about his drinking and gambling. Each time I saw evidence of Marion's efforts to hold that homestead together, the garden she'd planted, the repairs she'd made to the cabin, the livestock she tended alone. That land owes more to her labor than his. By the end of the first week, they had 4 solid witnesses and a stack of documentation that Morrison said was better than expected, though not quite enough to guarantee victory. Daniel Frost arrived on the afternoon stage, a compact man of 40 with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind. He spent 2 hours closeted with Marion, reviewing her documentation, asking pointed questions, and occasionally making notes in handwriting so cramped Jonah couldn't read it from across the room. When he emerged, his expression was thoughtful. "You have a case," he told them. "Not a strong one, but better than Morrison led me to believe. The witnesses help, the documentation helps. The fact that you were visibly pregnant while doing heavy labor will play well with a judge." "Will that be enough to beat Bellamy?" Jonah asked. Frost's smile was thin. "That depends on how dirty Bellamy wants to fight. He has resources I don't, connections I can't match. But he also has a reputation for being a bully, and judges don't always appreciate bullies." He looked at Marion. "The question is whether you're prepared for this, Mrs. Hale. Bellamy will attack your character. He'll suggest you're trying to profit from your husband's death. He'll paint you as an opportunist, or worse." "Let him," Marion said quietly. "I know the truth. That land is mine by right of every blister I earned clearing it, every meal I cooked on that stove, every night I lay awake worrying whether we'd make it through winter. If he wants to call me an opportunist for wanting to keep what I built, then he doesn't understand what work means." Frost studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Good. I can work with that." He turned to Jonah. "And you, Mr. Reeves. Bellamy will question your motives as well. Why would a drifter with no ties to Mrs. Hale spend his savings on her legal battle? He'll suggest impropriety, probably outright scandal. Let him suggest what he wants, won't change why I'm doing this." "Which is?" Jonah looked at Marion, at this woman who'd refused to break even when the world was crushing her, and told the truth he'd been avoiding. "Because she matters. Because what happened to her wasn't fair. Because if I've got money sitting unused while she loses everything, then what kind of man am I?" Frost's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "The kind who might actually win this case. All right, we file the competing claim tomorrow. The hearing will be in 2 weeks, Territorial Courthouse in Helena. Can you both travel that far?" "I can ride," Marion said. "You'll take the stage," Mrs. Cooper interjected. "You and Lily both. I'm coming too. Someone needs to help with the baby during the hearing. The stage costs not as much as losing your land. Don't argue with me, girl." Marion smiled despite herself. "Wouldn't dream of it." That night, after Frost had retired to his room and Mrs. Cooper had taken Lily for a few hours to give Marion rest, Jonah and Marion sat together in the quiet dimness of her room. The single lamp threw shadows on the walls, and outside the window, Iron Creek settled into its evening rhythms. "Jonah," Marion said quietly, "when this is over, however it ends, what will you do?" The question he'd been avoiding. "Don't know yet." "You could stay in Iron Creek. There's work here, good people. You've made friends." "Have I?" "Mrs. Cooper speaks highly of you. The Johnsons asked if you'd consider helping with their summer branding. Even Morrison said you were the kind of man Iron Creek could use." She paused. "And her voice dropped. "I would like it if you stayed." Jonah's chest tightened. "Marion, I'm not asking for anything you can't give. I know you're not looking for entanglements. I know I'm a widow with a baby and a legal battle and more trouble than I'm worth, but—" She looked at him, and in the lamplight her eyes were dark and earnest. "But you've been good to us, kind in ways I didn't know I needed, and the thought of you leaving, of going back to drifting with no purpose or direction?" She shook her head. "It seems wasteful. You're worth more than that." "Am I?" The words came out rough. "I'm a man with no land, no family, no prospects beyond what's in my saddlebags. What makes me worth anything? The fact that you stopped when you heard me scream? The fact that you risked your life for strangers? The fact that you're spending your savings to fight a legal battle that isn't yours?" Marion's voice was fierce now. "The fact that you bring wildflowers and read to my daughter and look at me like... She stopped abruptly, color flooding her cheeks. "Like what?" Jonah asked, his voice low. Marion met his eyes. "Like I matter. Like I'm not just the poor widow who needs saving. Like you see me, really see me, and still choose to be here. The air between them felt charged, heavy with things unspoken. Jonah knew he should pull back, keep the distance he'd maintained for weeks. Marian was grieving, vulnerable, in the middle of a crisis. This wasn't the time. But her hand was in his, and her eyes held his, and he was so damn tired of running from the one thing that had felt right since he'd pulled her from the rubble. "I do see you," he said quietly. "See your strength, your determination. See how you love Lily, how you refuse to give up even when the world's beating you down. See—" He stopped, swallowed. "See things I didn't think I'd see again after the war." "What things?" "Hope. Purpose." He squeezed her hand. "Reasons to stay in one place." Marian's breath caught. "Jonah? But you just lost your husband. You're fighting for your land. This isn't— I can't—" He struggled for words. "I won't take advantage of your situation." "What if I don't think it's taking advantage?" Marian leaned forward, her voice urgent. "What if I think it's two people who've both been lost finding something real in each other? What if—" She took a shaky breath. "What if I've been wondering for weeks whether you feel even half of what I feel when you walk into this room?" Jonah stared at her, his heart hammering. "Marian, you can't know what you feel right now. Your husband just died." "My husband died the moment he chose cards over his family," Marian said, her voice hard. "The gunfight just made it official. I grieved Thomas Hale months before he was buried, Jonah. Grieved the man I thought he'd become, the life I thought we'd build. But I'm done grieving ghosts." Her eyes blazed. "I know my own mind. I know what I feel. And what I feel when you're near is the first real thing I've felt in 2 years." The words hung between them, stark and honest and terrifying. "If I stay," Jonah said slowly, if this becomes something more, people will talk. They'll say you moved on too fast, that I took advantage, that we—" "Let them talk." Marian's voice was steady. "I've spent my whole life worrying about what people thought. Married Thomas partly because everyone said he was charming and handsome and a good match. Look how that turned out." She cupped his face with one hand. "I'm done living for other people's opinions. If I want to care about the man who saved my life, that's my choice. If I want to hope he cares about me too, that's my right." Jonah turned his head and kissed her palm, feeling her pulse jump against his lips. "I care," he said roughly. "More than I should, more than is probably smart right now. Then stay, fight this battle with me, and after—" her voice softened. "After, we'll see what comes next. No promises, no expectations, just the possibility of something real." Jonah looked at this woman who'd been crushed and widowed and threatened with losing everything, and was still brave enough to reach for what she wanted. Brave enough to risk rejection and judgment and failure because she believed in something better. He'd spent 5 years running from that kind of bravery. Maybe it was time to run toward it instead. "All right," he said. "I'll stay. We'll fight Bellamy. And after—" He managed a smile. "After, we'll see." Marian's answering smile was bright enough to light the whole room. She leaned forward, and for a moment Jonah thought she might kiss him properly, but instead she rested her forehead against his, her breath mingling with his in the small space between them. "Thank you," she whispered, "for stopping, for staying, for being you." They sat like that for a long time, not quite embracing but not quite apart, while outside Iron Creek settled into sleep, and inside the lamp burned low, and somewhere in the distance Lily made small baby noises in her dreams. The next week passed in a blur of preparation. Frost drilled Marian on her testimony until she could recite dates and details in her sleep. He coached their witnesses, refining their statements, anticipating Bellamy's counterarguments. Jonah spent hours going over the property boundaries with Morrison, making sure every detail of Marian's claim was airtight, and through it all, he and Marian moved around each other with a new awareness, a possibility that hummed in the air between them like a plucked string, not acting on it, not yet, not while everything was still uncertain, but acknowledging it, letting it exist. Mrs. Cooper noticed, of course. "You two are being remarkably proper," she observed one evening, watching them sit carefully apart while Frost reviewed documents. "We're in the middle of a legal battle," Marian said primly. Propriety seems appropriate. Hmm. And after the legal battle? Marian's eyes met Jonah's across the room. After, she said quietly. We'll see. 3 days before they were due to leave for Helena, Carter Bellamy himself rode into Iron Creek. Jonah was at the blacksmith's when word spread through town like wildfire. Bellamy's here, at the land office, demanding to speak to Marian. Jonah dropped the horseshoe he'd been examining and ran. He reached Morrison's office to find Bellamy inside. A large man in his 50s with an expensive coat and the kind of face that suggested he was used to getting what he wanted. Marian stood facing him, her chin high despite the fact that he towered over her by nearly a foot. Mrs. Hale, Bellamy was saying, his voice smooth as oiled leather. I think there's been a misunderstanding. I have no desire to take your land from you. I simply want to purchase it at a fair price. I don't want to sell, Marian said, but surely you see the logic. You're a widow with a baby. Managing a homestead alone would be— I managed it alone while my husband was alive, Marian interrupted. I can manage it now. Bellamy's smile tightened. The cabin is destroyed. Rebuilding would require resources you don't have. That's my concern, not yours. Mrs. Hale, I'm trying to be reasonable. No, Jonah said from the doorway, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. You're trying to bully a widow into giving up her land because you want the water rights. Bellamy turned, his eyes narrowing as he assessed Jonah. And you are? Jonah Reeves. Ah, the hero. Bellamy's tone made it sound like an insult. The drifter who happened to be in the right place at the right time and is now— what? Mrs. Hale's protector? Her champion? Her friend, Jonah said evenly, and I'm here to make sure she's not harassed. Harassed? Bellamy's voice went cold. I'm offering a fair business proposition. There's no harassment here. Then you won't mind leaving when she asks you to. Bellamy looked between them, his expression calculating. I see. This is more than friendship, isn't it? How convenient for you, Mr. Reeves. The widow's land, the widow's— Finish that sentence and we'll have a problem, Jonah said, his voice deadly quiet. The room went still. Morrison looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Marian's hands were clenched into fists. Bellamy smiled coldly. I'll see you in Helena, Mrs. Hale. And Mr. Reeves, I suggest you prepare yourself for disappointment. The law isn't swayed by romantic notions or heroic gestures. He tipped his hat mockingly. Good day. After he left, Marian sagged against the desk, her face pale. He's going to destroy us, isn't he? No, Jonah said firmly. He's going to try. There's a difference. But as he held Marian steady while she caught her breath, he couldn't quite silence the cold voice in his head that whispered Bellamy was right about one thing. The law wasn't swayed by heroics. And if they lost, Marian would lose everything she'd fought for, and Jonah would have failed to save her all over again. The stage to Helena left at dawn, rattling over rutted roads while Marian clutched Lily and tried not to think about everything that could go wrong. Beside her, Mrs. Cooper dozed against the window, and across from them, Jonah sat with the kind of alert stillness that came from years of watching for trouble. Daniel Frost had ridden ahead the day before, needing extra time to file paperwork and prepare their case. Marian hadn't slept the night before. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Bellamy's cold smile, heard his insinuation about her and Jonah. The man had a gift for making something decent sound sordid, and she knew he'd use that gift in court. Would twist her relationship with Jonah into something ugly, suggest she was using grief as an excuse to move too fast, imply that Jonah was taking advantage, or worse. The truth was so much simpler and so much more complicated. She cared about Jonah Reeves in ways that terrified her. Cared about his quiet strength, his unexpected gentleness with Lily, the way he looked at her like she was worth protecting, not because she was helpless, but because she mattered. It was nothing like what she'd felt for Thomas. That had been young infatuation, the thrill of being chosen by a charming man. This was deeper, steadier, built on shared crisis and mutual respect, and the kind of honesty that came from seeing each other at their worst. But none of that would matter to Bellamy or the judge, or anyone who decided her worthiness based on how long she mourned a husband who'd died drunk and cheating. Stop thinking so loud, Jonah said quietly. You'll wear yourself out before we even get there." Marion managed a weak smile. "Is it that obvious? Your jaw's been clenched for the last hour, and you keep looking at Lily like you're memorizing her face." "I am, a little. In case—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "We're not losing." Jonah leaned forward, his voice low and intense. "Frost is good. We have witnesses. We have documentation. And we have the truth on our side. Bellamy has money and connections. Had those in the war too. The side with more money, more supplies, more connections." Jonah's smile was grim, still lost sometimes. Mrs. Cooper stirred and opened one eye. "Are you two going to fret the whole way to Helena? Because if so, I'm going back to sleep. Wake me when we arrive or when you start making sense. Whichever comes first." Despite everything, Marion laughed. "How are you so calm?" "Honey, I've lived through 3 husbands, 2 fires, and a blizzard that killed half the town's livestock. A land dispute doesn't rate in my top 10 worries." She squeezed Marion's hand. "Besides, I've seen how this works. Bullies like Bellamy count on people being too scared to fight back. When someone actually stands up to them, they don't know what to do. And if standing up isn't enough, then we stand up harder." Mrs. Cooper's expression was fierce. "You're not alone in this, Marion. You've got this town behind you, a good lawyer beside you, and a man across from you who looks at you like you hung the moon. That's more than most people get." Marion felt her cheeks heat and couldn't quite meet Jonah's eyes. But when she finally glanced at him, he was watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. Not the carefully neutral look he'd worn for weeks, but something open and warm and quietly certain. They reached Helena by late afternoon, the territorial capital sprawling across a valley, with the confidence of a place that expected to matter. The buildings were newer than Iron Creek's, larger and more permanent, built by people who believed Montana's future would be made here. The territorial courthouse dominated the main square, a 2-story stone structure that looked like it had been transplanted from somewhere back east. Frost had secured them rooms at a modest hotel near the courthouse. "Rest tonight," he instructed when they met in the lobby. "Dulce, tomorrow morning we review your testimony one final time, and then the hearings at 2 o'clock. Judge Harrigan presiding." "What's he like?" Jonah asked. "Fair, mostly. Doesn't suffer fools or liars. Came out here from Philadelphia after the war, wanted to be part of building something new." Frost's expression was cautiously optimistic. "If we can prove Marion's contribution to the homestead improvements, he'll rule based on merit, not Bellamy's influence." "And if Bellamy's lawyer is good?" "Bellamy's lawyer is very good. Marcus Webb, imported from San Francisco specifically for this case. He'll attack every weak point in our argument and probably invent a few we haven't thought of." Frost looked at Marion. "Are you prepared for that? For him to question your character, your marriage, your motivations?" Marion thought about 2 years of watching Thomas choose whiskey over her, cards over their future, everything else over his family. Thought about being trapped under a beam while he lay dead in a saloon because he'd been too drunk to tell honest cards from marked ones. Thought about the careful, quiet way Jonah had helped her rebuild not just her physical strength, but her belief that she deserved better. "Let him question what he wants," she said steadily. "I know the truth. That land is mine by every measure that matters except the law, and I'm here to make the law catch up." Frost's smile was approving. "Good. Hold on to that tomorrow. Webb will try to rattle you. Don't let him." That night, Marion lay awake in the unfamiliar hotel room, Lily sleeping peacefully in a drawer they'd lined with blankets to serve as a makeshift cradle. Mrs. Cooper snored gently in the other bed. Outside, Helena's nightlife provided a distant soundtrack of saloon music and occasional shouts. A soft knock at the door made Marion's heart jump. She rose carefully, checking that her wrapper was decent, and opened the door to find Jonah standing in the hallway, his hair damp like he'd just washed, his expression uncertain. "Couldn't sleep," he said quietly. "Thought maybe you couldn't either." Marion glanced back at Mrs. Cooper's sleeping form, then slipped into the hallway, pulling the door almost closed behind her. "I keep thinking about tomorrow, about everything that could go wrong." "Me too." They stood in the dim hallway, close enough that Marion could smell the soap he'd used, could see the worry in his eyes that he was trying to hide. On impulse, she reached for his hand. Whatever happens tomorrow, win or lose, I want you to know something. Marion, no, let me say this. In case I don't get another chance. She took a breath. You changed my life, Jonah Reeves, not just by pulling me from that cabin, but by seeing me, by treating me like someone worth fighting for, by staying when you could have left. Her voice dropped. Whatever the judge decides tomorrow, that doesn't change. You've already given me more than I knew to ask for. Jonah's hand tightened on hers. If we lose, I'll figure something out. Find other land, start over. I've done it before. She managed a smile. But I won't lose you. Not if you don't want to be lost. I don't. The words came out rough, almost harsh. God help me, Marion, I don't want to be lost anymore. He pulled her close then, not quite an embrace, but near enough that she could rest her forehead against his shoulder, could feel his heartbeat through the thin fabric of his shirt. They stood like that for a long moment, drawing strength from each other while Helena settled toward sleep around them. We should rest, Marion finally whispered. Tomorrow's going to be hard. Tomorrow we win, Jonah said with more confidence than she felt. And then we figure out what comes next. He kissed her forehead, gentle and brief, and Marion felt the touch all the way to her bones. Then he stepped back, his hand sliding from hers with obvious reluctance. Good night, Marion. Good night, Jonah. She watched him walk back to his room before slipping inside her own, her heart full of hope and terror in equal measure. Morning came too quickly and too slowly. Marion dressed in the one good dress she owned, dark blue, modest, borrowed from Mrs. Cooper and taken in to fit. She pinned her hair back severely, trying to look respectable and responsible, and like someone a judge would trust. Lily fussed and had to be fed twice, as if sensing her mother's anxiety. At the courthouse, Frost met them on the steps, looking grimmer than Marion had seen him. Bellamy's brought reinforcements, 3 character witnesses prepared to testify about Tom's good standing in the community and his plans for the homestead. Plans he never executed, Jonah said flatly, which we'll point out, but it complicates things. Frost looked at Marion. Ready? She wasn't, but she nodded anyway. The courtroom was smaller than she'd expected, with wooden benches and a judge's bench that seemed designed to loom over everyone else. Already present were Bellamy and his lawyer, Marcus Webb, a silver-haired man with the kind of expensive suit that screamed San Francisco money. Behind them sat 3 men Marion didn't recognize, presumably the character witnesses. On their side of the room, Jonah, Mrs. Cooper, the Johnsons, and Pastor Williams, a pitifully small showing compared to Bellamy's forces. Judge Harrigan entered and everyone stood. He was younger than Marion expected, maybe 50, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and an air of no-nonsense efficiency. He surveyed the courtroom, his gaze lingering on Marion with something that might have been sympathy, then banged his gavel once. Let's proceed. Mr. Webb, you represent Mr. Carter Bellamy in his claim to the former Hale homestead? I do, Your Honor. And Mr. Frost, you represent Mrs. Marion Hale in her competing claim? I do, Your Honor. Then let's hear it. Mr. Webb, you may present first. Webb stood with the kind of theatrical grace that suggested he enjoyed performing. Your Honor, this case is straightforward. Thomas Hale filed a legal claim on the disputed property 3 years ago. He made significant improvements to the land, cleared 6 acres, built a cabin, dug a well, established fence lines. He worked that land until his untimely death 3 weeks ago. Upon his death, with no will filed and no joint claim established, the property legally reverted to territorial control. My client, Mr. Bellamy, has filed a proper claim on that land and is prepared to compensate Mrs. Hale fairly for the improvements her late husband made. And what is Mrs. Hale's objection? Judge Harrigan asked, looking at Frost. Frost stood. Mrs. Hale's objection is that she made those improvements alongside her husband, in many cases doing the majority of the physical labor herself. While the law didn't recognize her contribution at the time the claim was filed, the reality is that half or more of the improvements to that land are the result of her work. She has a moral and equitable claim that supersedes Mr. Bellamy's legal technicality. Moral and equitable claims don't trump legal ones, Webb said smoothly. If we allowed every widow to contest land claims based on their contributions during marriage, no property rights would be secure. Unless we're suggesting that women's labor counts for nothing, Frost countered, that a woman can work a piece of land for years and have no claim to it simply because her husband died without proper paperwork. Judge Harrigan held up a hand. I understand the arguments, gentlemen. Let's hear the evidence. Mr. Webb. What followed was 2 hours of testimony that felt like torture. Webb's witnesses painted a picture of Thomas Hale as a hardworking homesteader with big plans for his land, conveniently omitting his drinking and gambling. They described him clearing land, building the cabin, digging the well, never mentioning Marion at all, as if she'd been invisible. When Frost cross-examined, he exposed the cracks. One witness admitted he'd only visited the homestead twice, both times finding Tom in town instead. Another couldn't explain who'd planted the extensive vegetable garden if Tom had been so focused on the heavy construction work. The third reluctantly acknowledged hearing that Tom enjoyed cards, but insisted it was just recreation. Then it was their turn. Sarah Johnson took the stand first, and her testimony was devastating in its honesty. I visited Marion once a month for 2 years, she said firmly. Watched her work that land like a hired hand while 6 months pregnant. She hauled water, split wood, tended livestock, and planted every vegetable in that garden with her own hands. Tom was rarely there, usually in Iron Creek gambling or drinking. She looked directly at the judge. That woman earned that land 10 times over, Your Honor. If the law says otherwise, the law's wrong. Webb objected to the editorial, but the damage was done. Pastor Williams testified next, describing his 3 visits to the homestead to counsel Tom about his drinking, each time finding Marion working while Tom was absent or drunk. The Johnsons corroborated Sarah's testimony about Marion's labor and Tom's frequent absences. Then Frost called Marion to the stand. She walked forward on legs that trembled, very aware of Bellamy's cold eyes on her, of Webb's calculating expression, of Jonah's steady presence in the gallery. She swore her oath and sat. Frost's questions were gentle, designed to let her tell her story. She described the work she'd done, the acres cleared, the rocks hauled for the root cellar, the fence posts set while 8 months pregnant. She documented dates and details with the same meticulous precision she'd used in her written testimony. She spoke about the failing roof beam, how she'd begged Tom to fix it, how he'd said it was fine right up until the day it killed him. And through it all, she kept her voice steady and her eyes clear, refusing to cry even when describing being trapped under the rubble. Then Webb stood for cross-examination, and Marion felt her stomach clench. Mrs. Hale, he began, his voice oily with false sympathy. You've painted quite a picture of your late husband, a drunk, a gambler, a negligent father. Tell me, if he was so terrible, why did you marry him? I was young and thought I could change him. I see. And when did you realize you couldn't? About 6 months after we married. Yet you stayed. I was pregnant. Where else would I go? Webb smiled. Indeed. So you stayed with this terrible husband, on this homestead you claim to have worked so hard on. Tell me, Mrs. Hale, did your husband ever strike you? Marion blinked. No? Verbally abuse you? Not exactly. Did he prevent you from leaving? Keep you prisoner? No, but... So you chose to stay. Chose to work this land. Chose to remain in this marriage. Webb's voice sharpened. And now, 3 weeks after your husband's death, you're claiming ownership of his land and associating closely with a man you barely know. Some might call that opportunistic, Mrs. Hale. Some might call it survival, Marion shot back, her temper flaring. My husband left me and my infant daughter alone in a failing cabin to drink and gamble. The cabin collapsed while I was trapped inside. I nearly died. My daughter nearly died. And now you're suggesting I'm opportunistic for wanting to keep the land I bled for? I'm suggesting that your judgment might be clouded by recent trauma, that perhaps you formed an attachment to Mr. Reeves out of gratitude rather than genuine affection, and that this attachment is influencing your decisions about the land. My decisions about the land are based on 2 years of labor, or perhaps they're based on Mr. Reeves's offer to fund your legal battle. Tell me, Mrs. Hale, What is the nature of your relationship with Mr. Reeves? Marion felt the trap closing. If she admitted caring for Jonah, Webb would use it to suggest impropriety. If she denied it, she'd be lying under oath. Jonah Reeves saved my life, and my daughter's life, she said carefully. He's been a good friend during a difficult time. A friend who's spending his life savings on your legal battle. That's quite a friendship. Webb's smile was poisonous. Has he made any demands in return for this generosity? Any expectations about your future relationship? Objection, Frost said sharply. Counsel is implying impropriety without evidence. I'm establishing motive, Webb countered. Mr. Reeves stands to benefit significantly if Mrs. Hale wins this case. If they were to marry, for instance, he'd gain control of valuable land. The courtroom erupted. Judge Harrigan banged his gavel for silence while Marion sat frozen, feeling like she'd been struck. In the gallery, Jonah had half risen from his seat, his face dark with fury. Mr. Webb, the judge said coldly, unless you have evidence of conspiracy or fraud, you will not impugn the character of either Mrs. Hale or Mr. Reeves. Is that clear? Perfectly clear, Your Honor. I withdraw the implication. But Webb's smile said the damage was done. No further questions. Marion returned to her seat beside Frost, feeling like she'd been flayed. Mrs. Cooper reached over and squeezed her hand fiercely. Bastard, the older woman muttered. Absolute bastard. Frost called Jonah as their final witness, and Marion watched him walk to the stand with the same steady calm he'd shown pulling her from the wreckage. He swore his oath and sat, his eyes meeting Marion's briefly, long enough for her to see the promise there. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. Frost's questions were simple. When did you meet Mrs. Hale? What were the circumstances? Why did you help her? Why are you supporting her legal claim? Jonah's answers were equally simple. He'd heard screaming and stopped. He'd helped because leaving wasn't an option. He was supporting her claim because it was right, and because he had the means to do so. And what do you expect in return? Frost asked. Nothing, Jonah said flatly. She doesn't owe me anything. Whether she wins or loses this case, whether she wants me in her life or not, that's her choice. I'm helping because the land is hers by right of labor, and it's wrong that the law doesn't recognize that. Webb's cross-examination was brutal. He questioned Jonah's motives, his background, his lack of ties to Iron Creek. He suggested Jonah was a drifter looking for easy land, using Marion's vulnerability to his advantage. He insinuated that Jonah's rescue had been conveniently timed, that perhaps he'd had advanced knowledge of Tom's death and the cabin's condition. Through it all, Jonah's voice remained level and his answers consistent. No, he hadn't known Tom was dead. No, he had no designs on the land. No, he expected nothing from Marion. Yes, he cared about her and her daughter. No, he wouldn't apologize for that. So you admit to having romantic feelings for Mrs. Hale just weeks after her husband's death, Webb pressed. I admit to caring about a woman who's shown more courage and strength than anyone I've ever met, Jonah said. When those feelings started, or what they mean, that's between me and her, not you or this court. Judge Harrigan banged his gavel before Webb could respond. I think we've established Mr. Reeves's character sufficiently. Step down, Mr. Reeves. The closing arguments were mercifully brief. Webb argued that law must be upheld regardless of sympathy, that Marion's claim was based on emotion rather than legal standing, that Bellamy's claim was proper and should be honored. Frost argued that justice required more than legal technicalities, that Marion's labor gave her an equitable claim stronger than Bellamy's paperwork, that the law existed to serve people, not property speculators. Then Judge Harrigan leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. I'll take this under advisement. Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, at which time I'll deliver my ruling. The gavel fell with a sound like gunfire. They stumbled out of the courthouse into late afternoon sunshine that felt surreal after the dim courtroom. Marion felt hollowed out, wrung dry. Beside her, Jonah walked with his jaw tight and his hands clenched. That was brutal, Mrs. Cooper said bluntly. Webb's a snake, but Frost was good. And Marion, honey, you were magnificent. I let him trap me, Marion said numbly. About Jonah. About our relationship. You told the truth, Frost said. That's all you could do. And honestly, Mrs. Hale, Webb's implications about impropriety might work in our favor. Judge Harrigan clearly didn't appreciate them. Did you see his face when Webb suggested conspiracy? He was furious. But what if he rules against us anyway? Marion looked at the courthouse, at the stone building that held her future in its balance. What if the law really is more important than justice? Then we figure out what comes next, Jonah said quietly. Together. Marion looked at him, really looked at him, this man who'd risked everything for her, who'd stood in that courtroom and admitted he cared about her in front of everyone, who was promising her partnership regardless of what tomorrow brought. Together, she echoed, and managed to smile despite the fear still churning in her stomach. That night passed in a blur of anxious conversation and restless attempts at sleep. Mrs. Cooper tried to distract Marion with stories about her 3 husbands, and various disasters survived. Frost went over possible outcomes, trying to prepare them for every scenario, and Jonah sat quietly in the corner of their hotel room, his presence steady and reassuring even when words failed. At some point past midnight, when Mrs. Cooper had finally fallen asleep and Frost had retired to his own room, Marion found herself standing at the window, Lily asleep in her arms, watching Helena's few remaining lights. A soft knock made her turn. Jonah stood in the doorway, his expression uncertain. "Couldn't sleep," he said quietly. "Saw your light." Marion looked at Mrs. Cooper's sleeping form, then made a decision. She passed Lily carefully into the drawer cradle and slipped out into the hallway with Jonah, pulling a shawl around her shoulders against the night chill. They walked down to the hotel's small parlor, empty at this hour, and sat together on a worn sofa. For a long moment, neither spoke. "I'm scared," Marion finally admitted. "Not just about losing the land, about everything. About what people will say, what they'll think. About whether this, us, is real, or just crisis making us both desperate for something solid." Jonah took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I've been thinking about that too, wondering if I'm seeing things clear or if it's just, I don't know, old instincts, the need to protect something. And I think it's both. I think crisis brought us together, but what we've built since, that's real. That's choice." He met her eyes. "I chose to stay in Iron Creek when I could have left. Chose to help when I could have done the minimum. Chose to care about you and Lily when it would have been safer not to." His voice dropped. "Those weren't crisis decisions, Marion. Those were me deciding what kind of man I want to be." Marion felt tears prick her eyes. "What if we lose tomorrow? What if Bellamy gets the land? Then we find other land. Build something new. It won't be easy, but—" He squeezed her hand. "But I'm done drifting, Marion. Done running from anything that might matter. If you'll have me, I'm staying. In Iron Creek, in your life, wherever you need me to be." That's a big promise. "It's the only one I'm sure of." Marion leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder, feeling his arm come around her solid and warm. "I don't know what tomorrow brings, but I know I want you there for it. Always," Jonah promised, and kissed the top of her head. They sat like that until the first gray hints of dawn touched the windows. 2 people who'd found each other in wreckage and were determined to build something that wouldn't fall. Morning came too soon and not soon enough. Marion dressed with hands that trembled despite her best efforts, while Mrs. Cooper fussed over Lily and muttered prayers under her breath. The walk to the courthouse felt like marching toward a firing squad, every step heavy with the weight of everything that hung in the balance. The courtroom was already full when they arrived. Word had spread about the case, widow versus land baron, with a rescue hero thrown in for drama, and curious spectators filled the gallery. Bellamy sat with Webb looking confident and relaxed, like men who'd already won. On Marion's side, Frost shuffled papers with careful precision while Jonah sat rigid, his jaw tight. Judge Harrigan entered precisely at 9 o'clock. Everyone stood, and Marion felt her heart hammering so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. The judge settled into his seat, adjusted his spectacles, and looked out at the assembled crowd with an expression that gave nothing away. "I've considered the evidence and arguments presented yesterday," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. This case represents a conflict between legal technicality and equitable justice, a conflict that arises more often than the law likes to admit. Marion's hands clenched in her lap. Jonah shifted beside her, close enough that she could feel the tension radiating from him. The facts are not in dispute, Harrigan continued. Thomas Hale filed a homestead claim 3 years ago. He died intestate, with no will and no joint claim filed with his wife. By strict legal interpretation, the property reverted to territorial control, making Mr. Bellamy's subsequent claim valid. He paused, and Marion felt her heart sink. However, the law exists to serve justice, not to enable injustice. And there is considerable evidence that Mrs. Marion Hale contributed substantially, perhaps even primarily, to the improvements on that land. Hope flickered to life in Marion's chest. The testimony of Mrs. Johnson, Pastor Williams, and others establishes beyond reasonable doubt that Mrs. Hale performed significant labor on the homestead. She cleared land, planted crops, maintained livestock, and managed the property during her husband's frequent absences. The fact that the law at the time of filing did not recognize her contribution does not negate the reality of her work. Harrigan's voice hardened. And I will not allow this court to be used as an instrument for penalizing a woman simply because her husband failed to execute proper legal documents. Bellamy's confident expression began to crack. Webb leaned over to whisper something, but Harrigan held up a hand for silence. Mr. Webb raised questions yesterday about Mrs. Hale's relationship with Mr. Reeves, suggesting impropriety or conspiracy. I found those insinuations offensive and unsupported by evidence. A man who risks his life to save strangers and then supports their legal claim is demonstrating character, not conspiracy. And a widow who accepts help while fighting for what is rightfully hers is showing wisdom, not opportunism. Marion felt tears pricking her eyes. Beside her, Mrs. Cooper gripped her hand so tightly it hurt. However, Harrigan said, and Marion's brief joy evaporated, there remains the legal technicality that Mrs. Hale's name does not appear on the original claim. While I find this unjust, I cannot simply ignore established property law. Therefore, I am ruling as follows. He picked up a document and read formally. Mrs. Marion Hale's competing claim is upheld on the basis of equitable contribution. However, to satisfy legal requirements, she must either refile the claim in her own name within 30 days, paying all associated fees, or establish legal partnership with someone who can co-sign the claim. Marion's mind raced. Refiling would cost money she didn't have. Legal partnership meant, furthermore, Harrigan continued, I am awarding Mrs. Hale compensation for half the value of all improvements made to the property to be paid by the estate of Thomas Hale, which, having no other heirs, effectively means the territorial government will cover these costs. This should provide Mrs. Hale with sufficient funds to refile her claim. He looked directly at Bellamy. Mr. Bellamy's claim is denied. His filing fees will not be refunded, and he is ordered to pay court costs for both parties as penalty for what I consider to be an opportunistic attempt to exploit a widow's vulnerable position. The courtroom erupted. Bellamy surged to his feet, his face purple with rage. This is outrageous. You can't. I can, and I have, Harrigan said coldly. And if you'd like to add contempt of court to your expenses, Mr. Bellamy, please continue speaking. He banged his gavel 3 times. This court is adjourned. Mrs. Hale, please see the clerk about your compensation and refiling procedures. Good day. Marion sat frozen, unable to quite process what had just happened. Around her, people were cheering, Mrs. Cooper was crying, and Frost was grinning like he'd just won the lottery. And then Jonah's arms were around her, lifting her to her feet, and she was laughing and crying at the same time while he held her close enough that she could feel his heart racing as fast as hers. We won, she whispered against his chest. Jonah, we won. You won, he corrected, pulling back to look at her with an expression so full of pride and joy it made her chest ache. You fought for what was yours, and you won. We fought, Marion insisted. All of us. Together. Behind them, Bellamy was arguing furiously with Webb, his voice carrying across the courtroom. This is corruption. That judge is... Careful, Mr. Bellamy, Harrigan said mildly, still seated at his bench. I'm still here, and my patience is limited. Bellamy shot them all a look of pure hatred before storming from the courtroom, Webb hurrying after him. Marion watched them go and felt nothing but relief that this particular battle was over. The next hours passed in a blur of paperwork and explanations. The clerk walked Marion through the refiling process, calculated her compensation, and explained that the funds would be available within 2 weeks. Frost shook hands with everyone, accepted his fee with professional grace, and promised to handle any follow-up paperwork needed. "You did well," he told Marion as they stood on the courthouse steps in the afternoon sunshine. "Better than well. You were exactly what the judge needed to see, strong, honest, and completely unwilling to be intimidated." "I had good help," Marion said, looking at Jonah. Frost smiled. "Yes, you did. Mr. Reeves, if you ever need a character reference, I'll be happy to provide one." He tipped his hat. "And now, if you'll excuse me, I have a stage to catch. Mrs. Cooper, Mrs. Hale, Mr. Reeves, it's been a pleasure." After he left, the four of them, Marion, Jonah, Mrs. Cooper, and Lily, stood together on the courthouse steps, letting the reality of their victory sink in. "So what now?" Mrs. Cooper asked. "You've got your land, or you will once the refiling goes through. What's your plan, honey?" Marion looked at the mountains rising in the distance, at the Montana sky stretching endless and blue above them, at Jonah standing close enough that his shoulder touched hers. "Now," she said slowly, "I rebuild. A proper cabin this time, with beams that won't fail, a home that will last." "That's a big job for one person," Mrs. Cooper observed, her eyes twinkling. "I wasn't planning to do it alone." Marion turned to Jonah, her heart in her throat. "The judge mentioned legal partnership, someone to co-sign the claim with me. That would make everything simpler, legally speaking." Jonah's expression was unreadable. "Marion, I know what you're thinking, that it's too soon, that people will talk, that I'm asking too much." She took his hand, not caring who saw. "But I'm not asking you to marry me out of convenience or gratitude. I'm asking because over the past month you've become the person I trust most in the world. Because you see me, really see me, and still choose to stay. Because when I think about building a life on that land, I can't imagine doing it without you." Mrs. Cooper made a small squeaking sound of delight. Jonah's hand tightened on Marion's, his eyes searching her face. "You're sure?" he asked quietly. "Because once I say yes to this, to you, I'm not going anywhere. Not when things get hard, not when people gossip, not when you're stubborn, or I'm difficult, or the roof needs fixing again. I'm done drifting, Marion. If I stay, it's for good." "Then stay," Marion said simply. "Stay and help me build something that won't fall. Stay and be Lily's father. Not someday, not eventually, but now. Stay and—" her voice dropped. "And let me love you the way you deserve to be loved." For a moment, Jonah just looked at her, his eyes bright with emotion. Then he cupped her face in his hands, careful and tender, and kissed her properly for the first time. Not the gentle forehead kisses or quick pecks on the cheek they'd shared before, but a real kiss, deep and certain and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, Mrs. Cooper was fanning herself and grinning like a cat in cream. "Well," she said, "I suppose that's a yes." "That's a yes," Jonah confirmed, not taking his eyes off Marion. "To all of it, the land, the partnership, the marriage, if you'll have me." "I'll have you," Marion said, laughing through happy tears. "Of course I'll have you." They married in Iron Creek 2 weeks later, once the compensation had come through and Marion had refiled the homestead claim with both their names. It was a simple ceremony in the small church, with half the town crowding in to witness. Pastor Williams performed the service, his expression joyful as he pronounced them husband and wife. Lily, now 5 months old and growing more alert every day, wore a tiny dress Mrs. Cooper had stitched and gurgled happily throughout the ceremony as if she approved. Bellamy didn't attend, but his absence was a gift. The man had left Iron Creek the day after the ruling, taking his wounded pride back to his ranch and nursing his grudge in private. Marion suspected he'd cause trouble eventually. Men like that always did. But for now, she was content to let him sulk. The town women had organized a reception at the boarding house, complete with food and music and enough well wishes to last a lifetime. Sarah Johnson presented them with a quilt she'd made, each square representing something from their story: a cabin, a rope, a gavel, wildflowers. "For your new home," she said, hugging Marion tight. "May it be filled with love and laughter." "And may the roof stay up this time," someone added, and the whole room erupted in laughter. As evening fell and the celebration wound down, Jonah and Marion slipped away to the small room behind the schoolhouse where Marion had been living. Tomorrow they'd start the journey back to the homestead to begin rebuilding. Tonight, they had each other and Lily and the quiet certainty that they'd made the right choice. "Mrs. Reeves," Jonah said softly, pulling Marion close. "How does that sound?" "Perfect," Marion said, resting her head against his chest. "How does husband sound to you?" "Like something I never thought I'd be. Like something I'm grateful to become." He kissed the top of her head. "Thank you for seeing past the drifter to the man underneath. Thank you for stopping when you heard me scream." Lily chose that moment to demand attention, and they spent the next hour tending to her together, Jonah learning how to change diapers with comical awkwardness, while Marion tried not to laugh at his exaggerated expressions of dismay. It was ordinary and domestic and absolutely perfect. The next weeks were consumed with preparation and planning. Jonah hired workers from town to help with the heavy construction, determined that Marion's new cabin would be the strongest in the territory. He surveyed the old foundation, declared it sound enough to reuse, and began the careful work of building walls that wouldn't fail. Marion spent her days teaching. The school had officially hired her for the fall term, giving them steady income beyond what they'd make from the land. In the evenings, she'd ride out to the homestead with Lily, watching the cabin take shape beam by beam, wall by wall. Jonah worked with the focused intensity of a man building something permanent, something that would last, and Marion loved watching his vision become reality. They cleared more land together, planted a new garden, repaired the well, and built a proper barn for the horses they planned to train. Jonah had a gift with animals. The same steady patience he showed with Marion and Lily worked wonders with skittish horses. And they talked about making horse training their primary business while using the land for crops and grazing. By fall, the cabin was complete. It was modest, 4 rooms instead of the single room Marion and Thomas had built, but it was solid. Every beam was tested, every corner square, every nail driven with care. The foundation went deep, anchored to bedrock. The roof was double-layered and pitched to shed snow. It was, Jonah declared with satisfaction, a house built to last generations. The night they moved in, Marion walked through each room with Lily in her arms, marveling at the reality of it. A bedroom for them, a smaller room for Lily, a kitchen with a proper stove, and a main room with a fireplace big enough to heat the whole structure. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs, built with honest work and paid for with courage. "What do you think?" Jonah asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around both of them. "I think it's home," Marion said softly. "I think we built something real." That night, after Lily was asleep in her new room and the fire had burned down to embers, Marion lay in Jonah's arms in their marriage bed and thought about everything that had led to this moment. The collapsed cabin, the desperate rescue, the fight for her land, the quiet growing certainty that she'd found something rare and precious in this man who'd stopped when he heard her scream. "Jonah?" she whispered into the darkness. "Hmm? Do you ever think about how different things would be if you hadn't stopped that day? If you'd just ridden past?" He was quiet for a moment, his hand tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "Every day," he admitted, but not with regret, more like wonder, that I could have missed this, missed you and Lily and this life we're building. I wonder too, about fate or providence or whatever force put you on that road at that exact moment." She turned to look at him, barely able to make out his features in the dim light. "My mother used to say that some lives are meant to collide, that sometimes the universe conspires to bring people together who need each other." "You think we needed each other?" "I know we did. I needed someone to see me as more than a burden or a charity case, someone who'd fight for me, not because I was helpless, but because I deserved better." She touched his face. "And you needed a reason to stop drifting," Jonah finished. "A place to matter, a family to protect." His voice roughened. "I didn't know I was looking for you, Marion, but the moment I pulled you from that rubble, something in me recognized something in you, like I'd found the missing piece of a puzzle I didn't know I was trying to solve." Marian kissed him then, soft and deep, and felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. This was what love should be. Not the breathless infatuation she'd felt for Thomas, but something deeper and more solid, built on respect and trust and the knowledge that they'd both fight for each other, for their family, for the life they were creating together. Winter came and went. Lily learned to crawl, then toddle, filling the cabin with noise and laughter. Marian taught through the school year, coming home each afternoon to find Jonah working with horses or splitting wood or playing with Lily on the floor. They fell into rhythms, routines, the comfortable patterns of a real marriage. And in the spring, Marian realized she was pregnant. She told Jonah one evening after Lily was asleep, standing in the kitchen while he finished cleaning up from supper. He dropped the plate he was washing, caught it before it hit the floor, and then just stared at her with an expression of such pure joy it made her laugh. "You're sure?" "I'm sure. Dr. Walsh confirmed it yesterday." Jonah crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and lifted her off her feet, spinning her around while she laughed and told him to be careful. When he set her down, his eyes were bright with tears he wasn't bothering to hide. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "Our baby. Are you happy?" "Happy?" He laughed, the sound echoing through their sturdy cabin. "Marian, I don't have words. Terrified and thrilled and so grateful I can barely breathe. You're going to be a wonderful father. You already are, with Lily." "That's different. He stopped, corrected himself. "No, she's not different. She's mine just as much as this one will be mine. I don't see her as Thomas's daughter, Marian. I never have. She's ours." Marian's eyes filled with tears. "I know. I've watched you with her, the way you are with her, patient and gentle and completely devoted. That's why I knew you'd be happy about this baby." Their son was born in December, on Christmas Eve, in the same bedroom where Marian had spent restless nights planning her future. Mrs. Cooper attended the birth along with Dr. Walsh, while Jonah paced the main room wearing a path in the floorboards and trying not to panic every time Marian cried out. When it was over and Mrs. Cooper emerged with a tiny bundle, Jonah thought his heart might actually stop. "A son," Mrs. Cooper said, beaming, "healthy and loud. Marian's asking for you." Jonah entered the bedroom on unsteady legs to find Marian propped against pillows, exhausted but radiant. She held out her arms, and he sat carefully on the edge of the bed while she placed the baby in his hands. He was so small, red-faced and wrinkled and absolutely perfect. Jonah felt tears slide down his cheeks as he looked at this tiny person, his son, his blood, his future. "What should we name him?" Marian asked softly. Jonah thought about his father, dead of fever before the war, thought about the man who taught him to tie knots and treat animals kindly and stop when someone needed help. "Samuel," he said, "after my father, if that's all right with you." "Samuel Reeves," Marian tested the name, smiled. "It's perfect." 2-year-old Lily woke from her nap and came toddling into the bedroom, curious about the commotion. Jonah lifted her onto the bed, showing her the baby brother she'd have to share her parents with now. "Baby," Lily said solemnly, touching Samuel's tiny hand with one careful finger. "That's right, sweetheart," Marian said. "Your baby brother. You're a big sister now." Lily looked at the baby, then at Marian, then at Jonah. "Mine?" she asked. "Yours," Jonah confirmed, pulling her close. "And you're mine, and Samuel's mine, and Mama's mine. And we're all each other's. That's what family means." That night, after everyone had left and the household had settled into sleep, Jonah sat in the rocking chair by the fire with Samuel in his arms while Marian slept and Lily dreamed in her small bed. He looked around at the cabin they'd built, at the home they'd made, at the family they were raising, and felt a contentment so complete it was almost painful. He'd stopped drifting, put down roots, built something that would last. And it was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The years that followed were full in the way good lives are full, with work and worry and joy and struggle and moments of grace. Jonah's horse training business grew until he was known throughout the territory. Marian taught until a 3rd baby, another daughter, whom they named Grace, made it too difficult to manage both school and home, but by then they didn't need her income. The land provided, their work provided, their partnership provided. Lily grew into a thoughtful girl who loved books and horses in equal measure. Samuel became a serious boy who followed his father everywhere, learning horse handling and land management with the same focused intensity Jonah brought to everything. Grace was the wild one, fearless and laughing, keeping them all on their toes. And through it all, through hard winters and dry summers, through Lily's first day at school, and Samuel's broken arm, and Grace's tendency to wander off, Marion and Jonah built something stronger than any cabin. They built trust and partnership and the kind of love that deepened with time rather than fading. 20 years to the day after the cabin collapsed, the Reeves family gathered in their expanded home. The original 4-room cabin still stood at its heart, but Jonah had added on over the years, another bedroom when their 4th child arrived, then a 5th, until the modest homestead had become a proper ranch house bustling with life and noise. Lily was 20 now and engaged to a young rancher from the next valley over, planning a wedding for the fall. Samuel at 18 was talking about filing his own homestead claim to the north, ready to start building his own future. Grace at 16 was still deciding between becoming a teacher like her mother or a horse trainer like her father. The younger children, 10-year-old twins Daniel and Ruth, raced through rooms that hadn't existed when Jonah first laid those foundation beams. They gathered around the big table Jonah had built years ago, expanded twice to accommodate their growing family. The meal was simple: roast beef, potatoes, bread Marion had baked that morning, but the conversation was rich with love and laughter and the easy teasing of a family comfortable with each other. After supper, Jonah stood and raised his glass. 20 years ago today, he said, his voice carrying the weight of memory, I heard someone screaming and made the decision to stop. That choice changed my life in ways I couldn't have imagined. So here's to collapsed cabins and the treasures they hide. Marion stood, her eyes bright, and raised her own glass. To bare hands and brave hearts, and to building things that last. The children cheered and drank their cider while Marion and Jonah's eyes met across the table, communicating everything that words couldn't quite capture. Love and gratitude and wonder that they'd found each other, that they'd fought for each other, that they'd built this impossible, beautiful life from wreckage and hope. Later, after the children had scattered to their various evening activities and the kitchen was clean, Marion and Jonah sat together on the porch swing Jonah had hung years ago. The Montana sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, and from the barn came the soft sounds of horses settling for the night. Do you ever think about that day? Marion asked, leaning against Jonah's shoulder. Really think about it? All the time, Jonah admitted. Think about how I almost didn't hear you over the wind. How if I'd been riding a different route or left town an hour earlier or later, I would have missed you completely. My mother's theory about colliding lives, Marion said softly. I used to think it was romantic nonsense. Now I think she might have been right. Some meetings are too perfect to be accident. Maybe. Jonah pulled her closer. Or maybe I was just ready to stop running, and you were brave enough to see past the drifter to the man who wanted to stay. Marion turned to look at him, this man who'd aged well over 20 years, his hair graying at the temples, but his eyes still as steady and sure as the day he'd pulled her from the rubble. Do you have any regrets? Not one. Jonah's voice was certain. Every choice I made that day, stopping, digging, staying, fighting for you, led to this, to us, to a family and a home and a life worth living. He cupped her face, his thumb tracing the lines that time and laughter had etched around her eyes. I never rescued strangers that day, Marion. I just dug my way to the family I hadn't met yet. Marion felt tears slip down her cheeks, happy tears, the kind that came from a heart too full to contain its joy. I love you, Jonah Reeves. 20 years ago and 20 years from now and every day in between. Oh, I love you too, Jonah said, and kissed her the way he had on their wedding day, on the day each of their children were born, on 1,000 ordinary evenings that had somehow added up to an extraordinary life. From inside the house came the sounds of their children, Lily's laugh, Samuel's voice, Grace arguing good-naturedly with the twins about something inconsequential. The ranch Jonah had built stretched around them, solid and prosperous. The land Marion had fought for sustained them all. and the love they'd forged from crisis and choice continued to grow deeper with every passing year. As darkness fell and the first stars emerged, Marion and Jonah sat together on their porch swing, surrounded by everything they'd built. Not just the physical structures, but the intangible things that mattered more. Trust and partnership, and a love strong enough to outlast storms, gunfights, and falling roofs. Complete, enduring, whole, and built, most importantly, on a foundation that would never fall. Not because the beams were strong, though they were, but because it was held up by something stronger than lumber or nails. It was built on the choice two broken people had made to see each other, to fight for each other, to build something together that neither could have built alone. It was built on love. And that, Marion knew as she sat in Jonah's arms watching the stars emerge over Montana, was the strongest foundation of all.